thrillers are my thing. It's what I've always liked to read, and so that's why I sort of consciously went back to that for The Banker's Wife. Yeah, I tend to machinate a lot on um, and then, like, when something clicks, I write pretty quickly. That one was similar to The Darlings in that I was like, "Someone needs to write about this, like, how is no one writing about this?" And it was right around the time the Panama Papers had come out, which, were these, sort of a download of, internal information from a law firm in Panama, um, became public and sort of revealed that a lot of people were storing money offshore. I had some familiarity with the world of offshore banking just from being a lawyer, but nothing close to what I ended up, I spent months and months researching it. And I just, I've always been sort of interested in money and power and sort of how, the sort of finance world, I feel like people don't really write about enough. And I find it really interesting and like sort of, fun and glamorous and all that. But I think most people, I've gotten a lot of interview comments like, wow, like finance is so boring. Like, why do you, how do you make finance interesting? And anyway, it was just one of those stories that, like, when I started reading, the first early glimmers of that story, I was like, no one's talking about this. And it's wild. I mean, the offshore world is enormous and it touches so many things. And it just felt to me like it wasn't getting any airtime. And so I started kind of digging into it. And I became fascinated by, the Swiss banks and privacy and how much money is just in this offshore economy. And so I actually started writing. So again, like as I said, like it was like the plot came first and the character second. So I I was sort of toggling between, do I write it from the perspective of a journalist who's kind of uncovering this story because that's what I was kind of doing, or do I make it really personal and try and have someone who's really inside the story? So I actually started writing it from two different perspectives. So one is the banker's wife, and one is a journalist following the story. And I literally got to like 100 pages with each, and I was like, man, I really like both these stories. I don't know which direction to go in. And then, like, I just woke up one night and was like, what if I use both of them and just sort of braid them together? And that's what I did. And it worked sort of to my shock and surprise. So that's how I ended up with those two characters. And one of the things I like consciously wanted to do when I was writing that book was write sort of a traditional thriller. And by that, I mean not like domestic suspense, which at the time and continues to be like this saturation in the market of sort of Gone Girl-esque books, which, are great and have their place. I just felt like that's not what I wanted to write. I wanted to write kind of like a really classic, kind of what I consider like an old school Nelson DeMille kind of novel, but with a woman as a protagonist, which I felt like you just didn't see very often. And especially with the sort of deluge of domestic suspense where the woman at the center of the book is always kind of like an anti-hero, and she's sort of always crazy or drunk or like a mess. And it's like about how, she's getting revenge on her ex-husband or whatever. And I was like, god, these women are so depressing. Like, they're not smart, they're not reliable. Like, the unreliable narrator trope has been done a million times. And so I wanted to have like like a sort of counterpoint to that and say like, okay, what if, you take sort of, a classic Grisham novel, but the main character is a woman. And so that's really what I was looking to do with, both Marina and Annabelle. They're both well educated, they're intelligent, they sort of survive the novel by, their wits alone. And they're reliable. Like, they're kind of people that you are pulling for, and you're not, they're not going to like rip off a mask halfway through the book and tell you they're a serial killer. Like, that's sort of not the twist that I was looking for. So that was super important to me, and it continues to be. And it's something I will do consciously, I think, for a while. I can't imagine like veering from that. So yeah, anyway, for me, that's super important. And I also feel like, I sort of spent my first career life in finance being kind of one of the only women in the room. And the sort of finance world and the legal world are so male dominated. And, I guess so I come at this sort of world from like a little bit of a unique perspective. And so I think that's one thing I can offer. And, I think people always write the best when they're kind of not necessarily writing what they know, but you say like, why am I the right person to tell this story? And I think that is, part of my background is coming out of the world of finance. And so, but as a woman, so it's, the characters I tend to relate to on that level. And so Marina is a character in The Darlings, and I resurrected her for The Banker's Wife, because she was like a character that I saw really clearly when I was writing The Darlings. And she wasn't a major character. She was like a young up and coming journalist. And then she's become sort of more senior by the time this book is written. But she was one of those characters that just like stuck with me, and I really got her, and I felt like I had this whole like inner life for her that probably wasn't merited given how minor a character she was. But it's sort of, by the time we got to The Banker's Wife, I felt like she was this really well developed character in my own mind. But I read dialogue out loud a lot, because I just feel like, I don't know, sometimes when you read it out loud, you sort of catch, you're like, oh, that's like such an awkward, clunky way to say that. And so, I do that. And I also try, it's hard when you're writing two different women to like make sure their voices are different. When you're alternating chapter to chapter, you don't want it to sound like two women who are exactly the same person. So I actually wrote the two stories almost like separately and then put them together later on. And that's where a good outline is helpful. But I did that so I could sort of like inhabit one character at a time. One thing I realized in that book, which I've done consciously now in the book that followed and the book I'm working on now, is I do think, for thrillers to have, every scene needs to matter. So like there's no room for filler in thrillers. Like you can't, there's no sort of inner monologue, like you just no. So I mean, I tend to really see my books like the way you would see a movie, where you like physically see the scene. So now when I plot it out, I write out like, where is the scene literally taking place and what needs to occur in the scene to move the plot forward. And if I can't answer that question, I don't even start writing the scene. So I have that going in. So I feel like, it sounds sort of ridiculous to say it that way, but like it took me a couple books to realize, like, like I have a bunch of sort of clunky scenes in The Darlings that probably could have been, streamlined or cut all together. And I think by the time I got to The Banker's Wife, I was like, okay, every scene needs to serve a purpose. And if you can delete it and there wouldn't be an issue, like then you need to delete it. And that's kind of my sort of going back to legal writing. It's sort of, how do you get in sort of an economical way from point A to point B? And I think that's, in essence, what good thriller writers do is they, it's really, really streamlined. And that is a lot harder than it looks. I think it comes off as effortless when you're reading John Grisham. And then, when you're doing it, it's sort of brutal. And editing is, a nightmarish process. But I think it's, when you get sort of the hang of it, you realize like each scene has to be pretty short, pretty well articulated, and something sort of, there needs to be like a change, and sort of almost like I see scenes like as books unto themselves, like they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You sort of go through the arc of the chapter and then you move on to the next chapter. So Girls Like Us, again, I was sort of, it was like a news story that caught my attention that I had been obsessed with for years, which was the Gilgo Beach murders. In 2010, there were a series of bodies found along a stretch of beach in Gilgo Beach in Long Island, which is not too far from where my family has a house and where I grew up spending the summers. And so just because it's like literally down the beach for me, I became fascinated by the story. And the case went cold really quickly, and it's still unsolved, but it's, sort of an awful story where I think at some point by the end, they had found, now I can't remember if it was somewhere between 10 and 13 bodies of young women, that had all been sort of ritualistically buried in similar fashion in this very small deserted stretch of beach. And so I became very interested in that story. I also have always wanted to write a book set in Long Island since I grew up spending a lot of time there, and I was interested in the kind of wealth gap out there and the sort of dynamics of power out there with, the sort of very wealthy summer community and then, the local community there, and there's sort of the tension between them. And so I knew I wanted to write a book that focused on a similar incident. And I wasn't sure again who should be like my lead into that story. And one of the most interesting kind of conspiracy theory type, when you go down these rabbit holes or you start really researching, especially a serial killer, there are all kinds of like weird websites that have like theories on who the Gilgo Beach murderer was. And anyway, there were a couple people, and there's a documentary film about them that sort of suggests this, that there was a theory that there might have been some police involvement, because it was like, there was like basically no investigation into this, even though it was such a humongous news story. And so there was sort of a suggestion that, some of the police officers had either, knew the girls who were murdered, or some people went so far as to say the murderer himself was a police officer. And that's this part I thought was the most interesting. So that's how I came up with the character of Nell, who's the daughter of a police officer who's passed away, and she returns to Long Island. So I kind of wanted her to be like an insider in the sense that she knows like all the cops in Long Island and she knows the place really well, but she's has some distance. Like she's not herself a police officer. It's like she's returning home to kind of solve this mystery. So anyway, that's why I wanted her to have a law enforcement background, but not actually be like a member of the Suffolk County Police Department. I got really lucky. I was telling a bookseller friend of mine out in Long Island that I was working on this book, and she like looked at me like and was like, "You should talk to my husband." And I said, "Why?" And she's like, "He was a Suffolk County Police Department homicide officer for years and during that case." And I was like, "Really? Are you serious?" So we went out for drinks and he was awesome. So we talked for, I mean, I interviewed him a lot, and he connected me to other people that helped, me work, like develop this book. But I got really, really lucky there because I honestly was a little nervous to write about it because I was like, this is like this whole inner world that I don't really have insight into. But yeah, I sort of lucked my way into someone who was intimately involved in the homicide division. And so anyway, that was pretty cool. And the research is really fun. And then in terms of the FBI, I have a couple of law school friends that work in law enforcement, so they connected me to people who work in sort of similar esque capacities. So I have three little kids now, so anytime I'm working is time away from them, and I love what I do. It's like it's fun. I mean, it's my hobby. So I feel like that keeps me sane. I'm wildly behind on this book, set in the art world, and it's kind of similar to The Banker's Wife, and then it's sort of an international financial scandal, but that takes place in the art world. And it's a story that I've had sort of kicking around in my brain for a couple of years. So I'm really, really excited to write it. And then I think the coolest part about it is there's a component of it that's sort of about the sort of appropriation of Cuban art, which is just personally something I'm interested in since my family is from Cuba. And so that's been really cool because I've gotten to talk to my mom a lot about her childhood and, talk to a lot of her friends about their experiences kind of leaving Cuba in the wake of the revolution. So that's been what's kept me sane for the last, or relatively sane for the last year.